Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, the first of a series of episodes based on The Curious Lore of Precious Stones by George Frederick Kunz. I've been considering for some time the best way of rendering down the information found in this book for Ars Magica. A pair of plot hooks were shaken loose in an earlier episode about gemstones that are possessed by tiny false gods. For simplicity, I've carved the book up into chapters and then thrown out anything that's outside Mythic Europe or postdates the game period for Ars Magica, save where I can shoehorn it in. This episode covers general material. Follow-up episodes will dive into specific types of gemstone and specific forms of divination. Kunz gives many magical effects for each stone, but it's not necessary that every myth he relates be true, or that all stones of each type share exactly the same properties. Each power might be a virtue of the stone, granted to the carrier, but they might also be divine or infernal powers caused by aligned spirits which dwell inside the stones. I'm sorry, I'll be quoting Kunz an awful lot while I'm reading from his material. I did originally have LibriVox recordings of all of this material, but I've cut it up so much it's easier for me just to read it again rather than having to re-edit their work. So thanks to the LibriVoxians for the inspiration. The source of engraved stones. Kunz noted that talismanic stones were produced in greatest quantity in Alexandria, but that they had been shipped everywhere and that they were no longer made in the game period. In part, this is because Alexandria fell to Islamic forces, and the new rulers were not in favour of the depiction of material things in art. Time to quote Kunz. After the 3rd or 4th century of our era, the art of gem engraving seems to have been lost, or at least to have been very seldom practised, and it is noteworthy in the manner that after this period, writers who treat of the virtues of engraved gems as talismans rarely, if ever, use the words "if you engrave" such and such a figure on a stone, but write "if you find" such a figure. As the art of gem engraving was not practised in the Middle Ages, some medieval writers supposed that the engraved talismanic gems current in their time were not works of art but of nature, and Conrad von Miggenberg, accepting this view, gave it as his opinion that God granted these stones their beauty and their virtue for the help and comfort of the human race, adding that when he hoped to receive help from them, in no wise he denied the grace of God. Pause Kunz for a moment there for some plot hooks. Gem engraving is one of those arts which magic is particularly suited to because it uses materials that are very expensive unless you are temporarily creating them for the process, as you do when using Rigo magic. Many early talismans were carved with tiny sharp sapphire tips. Later, these were replaced with wheels that were dusted with a hard substance, diamond being best. The idea that some stones are naturally disgorged from the earth with images upon them moves them away from claims of idolatry. But what happens when the images on a gem are related directly to the iconography of the Order of Hermes? Can your Covenant mine stones with odd characters on them, or make their own stones more valuable by pretending to? Designs of virtue. Time to quote again. The virtue believed to be inherent in precious stones was thought to gain an added potency when the stone was engraved with some symbol or figure possessing a special sacredness, or denoting and typifying a special quality. It is true that the earliest engraved stones, the Babylonian cylinders and Egyptian scarabs, were both designed to serve an eminently practical purpose as well, namely that of seals. But in a great number of instances, these primitive seals were looked upon as endowed with talismanic power and were worn on the person as talismans. A list of these symbolic designs is said to have been given in the Book of Wings by Ragiel, one of the curious treatises composed about the 13th century under the influence of Hebrew and Greco-Roman tradition. Although it owes its origin to the Hebrew Book of Raziel, it bears little, if any, likeness to that work. Let's break out some plot hooks. Note that book's date. It suits the game period perfectly. I've cut up the list that Kunz gives, slotting it into each stone, which will come in future episodes, but at its most basic, I suggest that the appropriate character engraved into the stone adds +1 to the material bonus for the stone. Note that some people thought that wax seals made by their signets had a minor power of their own related to the image. The core rules don't handle that fantastically well, but you can simulate it by having a ring cast a small spell with a sealed object, for example, using the fairy duration until. This style of magic is probably of great interest to House Guernicus because binding oaths are a form of conditional curse, and conditional curses are, surprisingly, one of the things that Hermetic magic is really bad at, and they would make the lives of the Order's contract lawyers a lot easier. Alexander the Great, and to quote Kunz again, in Roman times the image of Alexander the Great was looked upon as possessing magical virtues. It is related that when Cornelius Macer gave a splendid banquet in the Temple of Hercules, the chief ornament on the table was an amber cup, in the midst of which was a portrait of Alexander, and around this his whole history figured in small, finely engraved representations. From this cup Macer drank to the health of the Pontifex, and then ordered it should be passed around among the guests, so that each one might gaze upon the image of the great man. Pollio, relating this, states that it was a common belief that everything happened fortunately for those who bore the likeness of Alexander's portrait, executed in gold or silver. Indeed, even among Christians, coins of Alexander were in great favour as amulets. So the stern John Chrysostom sharply rebuked them for wearing bronze coins of this monarch attached to their heads and feet. As illustrating the eclectic character of some of these amulets used in early Christian centuries, we may note one in the Cabinet of Medals in Paris. This has upon the obverse the head of Alexander the Great, and on the reverse a she-ass with her foal, and below a scorpion and the name of Jesus Christ. Another amulet of this class, figured by Vittori, also has the head of Alexander on the obverse, while the reverse bears the Greek monogram of the name Christos. I'd suggest these coins are powerfully aligned to the art of Rigo. I'd also note that this style of Alexander worship might fit in with some of the cult of heroes, mythic bloodline stuff that House Mercure mucks around with. Also, the Pontifex, of course, the chief bridge builder of Rome, is claimed as the ancestor of House Guernicus. Astrology. Kunz again. Many engraved stones of the Roman imperial period bore the figures of Serapis and Isis, the former signifying time and the latter earth. On other stones, the symbols of the zodiacal signs appear, referring to the natal constellation of the wearer. These designs were usually engraved on onyxes, carnelians, and similar stones in Greek and Roman times, but occasionally the emerald was used in this way, and more rarely the ruby or sapphire. Here, the costliness of the material was probably thought to enhance the value of the amulet. Figures engraved on precious stones were supposed to have a greater or lesser degree of efficacy in themselves, independent of the virtues peculiar to the stone on which they were engraved, and this efficacy depended largely upon the hour, day, or month during which the work was executed. For the influence of the planet, star, or constellation, which was in the ascendant, was thought to infuse a subtle essence into the stone, while the appropriate image was being engraved. However, to exert the maximum power, the virtue of the image must be of the same character as the virtue inherent in the material, and the gem became less potent when this was not the case. Certain images, those symbolising the zodiacal signs, for instance, were looked upon as possessing such power that their peculiar nature impressed itself upon stones, inherently of different qualities. Others, again, were only efficacious when engraved on stones, the quality of which was in sympathy with them. Plot hooks. So this adds birthstones and natal horoscopes to our lore. I'd suggest these are perfect for longevity charms. Note that the maximum power is attained by having them carved at an exact time of year with the correct figure on the correct stone. Miscellaneous symbols. An Italian manuscript dating from the 14th century gives the following talismanic gems. I'd suggest each of these adds +1 to the gem's material bonus. Remember, no mundane person in Europe carves stones anymore. You'll need to find them naturally occurring, or learn to do it yourself, or borrow the skills of a craftsman from an older covenant, or find fairies who will copy the figures for you. These negotiations and preparations are a source of stories. Note also that some of these sources will only provide a single figure. Your load of stones with the mark of a goat won't necessarily have any stones with the sign of the reaper. Time to quote Kunz, who is quoting the translation of 14th century Italian, and for some reason has gone with Jacobean English. Let's wade in. If thou findest a stone on which is graven or figured a man with a goat's head, whoever wears this stone with God's help will have great riches and the love of all men and animals. That sounds worse in the modern day than at the time, one imagines. Moving on. If the stone be found on which is graven or figured an armed man or the draped figure of a virgin, bound with laurel and having a laurel branch in her hand, this stone is sacred and frees the wearer from all changes and haps of fortune. When thou findest a stone which is graven the figure of a man holding a scythe in his hand, the stone imparts strength and power to the wearer, every day adds to his strength, courage, and boldness. Hold dear the stone on which thou shalt find figured or cut the moon or the sun, or both together, for it makes the wearer chaste and guards him from lust. A jewel to be prized is that stone on which is graven or figured a man with wings, having beneath his feet a serpent, whose head he holds in his hand. A stone of this kind gives the wearer, by God's help, abundant wealth of knowledge, as well as good health and favour. Shouldst thou find a stone on which is the figure of a man holding in his right hand a palm branch, this stone, with God's help, renders the wearer victorious in disputes and in battles, and brings him the favour of the great. A good stone is that one on which thou shalt find graven or figured a serpent with a raven on its tail. Whoever wears this stone will enjoy high station and be much honoured. It also protects from the ill effects of heat. I think that's probably a Diadne stone. Interesting. On many of the amulets fabricated in Italy for the protection against the dreaded jettatura, or the spell of the evil eye, the cock is figured. His image was supposed in ancient times to assure the protection of the sun god, and his crowing was regarded as an inarticulate hymn of praise to this deity. He was also a type of dauntless courage. All this contributed to make him a defender of the weak, especially of women and children, against the wiles of the spirits of darkness. And now a diversion into the ancient shapes of carved stones. Again quoting Kunz. A class of amulets even older than the Egyptian scarabs is represented by the engraved Assyrio-Babylonian cylinders. There has been much discussion among scholars as to their original purpose, some holding they were exclusively employed as seals or signets, while others incline to the belief that many of them were intended only for use as amulets or talismans. These cylinders are perforated and were worn suspended from the neck or wrist, as is most frequently the case with talisman, and often represented religious or mythological subjects, the accompanying inscription merely consisting of the names of gods. Cylinders of this type could not have been used as personal signets. It is quite possible that Dr. Weidemann is right in supposing that their imprint on a document was considered to import a certain mystic sanction to the agreement and render the divinities or spirits accountable for the fulfillment of the contract. The oldest known form of seal is this cylinder. Babylonian and Assyrian cylinder seals are known to date as early as 4000 BC. From the earliest period until 2500 BC, they were made of black or green serpentine, conglomerate diorite, and frequently the central core of a large conch shell from the Persian Gulf. From 2500 to 500 BC, the cylindrical form was prevalent. The materials included a brick-red Pharyngeus quartz, red hematite, an iron ore, and chalcedony, a beautiful variety of the last-named stone, known as sapphirine, sometimes being used. On the cylinders produced from 4000 BC to 2500 BC, the designs most frequently represent animal forms. On those dating from 2500 BC to 500 BC are generally inscribed 5 or 6 rows of cuneiform characters. Up to the last named date, the work was all done by the sapphire point and not by the wheel. It's not until the 5th century BC that wheel work is apparent on any Babylonian or Assyrian stone engraving. In the course of the 6th century BC, cylindrical seals became less frequent, and tall cone-like seals came into use. A new type makes its appearance in the 5th or 6th century BC, namely the scaraboid seal. From the 3rd century BC until the 2nd or 3rd century AD, the seals became lower and flatter, the perforation larger until sometimes they assumed the form of rings, and later the ring form becomes general. They are usually hollowed a little in the middle, which gives them the shape and size of the lower joints of a reed. Indeed, it has been suggested that the original seal was patterned rudely after a reed joint. The materials used for these cylinders include lapis lazuli, very freely used, probably from Persian mines, jasper, rock crystals, chalcedony, carnelian, agate, jade, etc. A hard black variety of serpentine is perhaps the the most common of all the materials used for this purpose. The Cretan peasants of today set a high value upon certain very ancient seals, dating perhaps from as early as 2500 BC, which they find buried in the soil. These seals are inscribed with symbols supposed to represent the prehistoric Cretan form of writing. Of course, these inscriptions, which have not yet been deciphered by archaeologists, are incomprehensible to the peasants, but they undoubtedly serve to render the stones objects of mystery. The peasants call them gallopetrae, or milk stones, and they are supposed to promote the secretion of milk, as was the case with gallacite. The careful preservation of these so-called gallopetrae by Cretan women has served the purpose of archaeological research, as otherwise so large a supply of these very interesting seals would not now be available. Some of the cylinders seem to be able to lay a hex on an agreement so that it harms those who break it, and this is a form of fairy worship and is probably of great interest to House Guernicus. Milk stones may have a strong Creo influence, or be a vis source, or be the external vis source of the fairies who desire the milk for themselves. And now genitals. Well, that was a segue. Quoting Kunz, "It is a well-known fact that many amulets were made in forms suggesting objects offensive to our sense of propriety. They were thought to protect the wearers by denoting the contempt they felt for the spirits leagued against them. Some such fancy may have induced the peculiar designs of certain of the jewels alleged to have been pawned in Paris by the ex-Sultan Abdul Hamid for the sum of 1,200,000 francs. According to rumour, these pledges must be sold as the Sultan has failed to redeem them, but the designs are so risque that they cannot be offered in public sale. Therefore the stones and pearls are to be removed and the gold settings are to be melted and sold as metal." Notes: that sounds like a problem Yabut and Magi might have. Just because you want animate statues of perfect human forms to use as servants doesn't mean you should, or that the church isn't going to question what's going on when you do. There is a lengthy folk tradition in England that nakedness scares away demons. I like the idea that some of the most powerful apatropoic magic, I can never pronounce that word, magic that scares away the spirits of darkness, some of the most powerful items in the order need to be hidden because they look so vulgar. It seems like just the sort of thing that a spiteful Verditas magus might do. Funeral scarabs were often made of jasper, amethyst, lapis lazuli, ruby or carnelian, with the names of gods, kings, priests, officials or private persons engraved in the base. Occasionally monograms or floral devices were also engraved. Sometimes the base of the scarab was heart-shaped, and in others the scarab was combined with the utat, the eye of Horus, and also with the frog, typifying revivification. Set in rings, they were placed on fingers of the dead, or else, wrapped in linen bandages, they rested on the heart of the deceased. They were symbols of the resurrection of the body. Some Egyptian scarabs were evidently used as talismanic gifts from one friend to another. 2 such scarabs are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. One bears the inscription, "May Ra grant you a happy new year." The text of the other reads as follows: "May your name be established, may you have a son, and may your house flourish every day." On the Egyptian inscribed scarabs used as signets were engraved many of the symbols to which a talismanic virtue was attributed. The Uraeus serpent, signifying death, is sometimes associated with the knot, the so-called Ankh symbol denoting life. Often the hieroglyph for nub, gold, appears. This symbol is a necklace with pendant beads, showing that gold beads must have been known in Egypt in early days when the hieroglyph for gold was first used. All these symbolic figures, of which a great number occur, serve to impart to the signet a sacred and auspicious quality, which was communicated itself to the wearer, and even to the impression made by the seal, thus in turn acquiring a certain mystic force. Many scarabs and signets exist made of artificial cyanus, imitation lapis lazuli made in Egypt. This was an alkaline silicate coloured a deep blue with a carbonate of copper. Often a wonderfully translucent or opaque blue glass was used. The genuine lapis lazuli was also used to a considerable extent for scarabs and cylinders in Egypt and Assyria, and gems were also cut from it in Imperial Roman times. A notable instance of the use of lapis lazuli in ancient Egypt was on the material for the image of truth, Ma, which the Egyptian Chief Justice wore on his neck, suspended from a golden chain. In Roman times, some of the legionaries are said to have worn rings set with scarabs, for the reason that this figure was believed to impart great courage and vigour to the wearer. Some closing notes. In parts of the Order, the Feather of Maat is found in magic items wielded by the Gewenikus in their duties. It's mentioned in Sanctuary of Ice, for example, and fits the Alpine cultural trend of harking back to ancient glories. The scarab might make a suitable badge for the Order's hoplites. In future episodes, we'll dive into the uses of individual types of gemstone, a discussion of practices involving scrying, and statistics for an opalized plesiosaur. But let's draw our time with Kunz for this week to an end. Your saga may vary.